Welcome to the Seven Nation Army podcast, where we talk about which countries have the most immigrants in the US. I'm your host, Arturo. The focus of my section will be the Philippines. Now, most people aren't aware of this, but Filipinos are the largest immigration group in the US, right behind Mexicans and Chinese. Despite this, though, there are many sociologists who explain how Filipino culture is barely recognized in the US, especially as compared to other immigrant groups. Filipino-American sociologist, author, and educator Dr. Anthony Ocampo details the strange history of identity Filipinos have in the US in his book, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race. In this book, Ocampo instantly sets the tone for Filipino immigration and the Filipino American experience by detailing a story of when he was rejected for a study on Chinese Americans, with a research official stating that he was not genetically similar enough. Besides the strangeness of the sociological validity of such a statement, Ocampo set out to understand how Filipino culture is, generally speaking, unknown in the US, as well as how it could be possible for a sociology researcher to fail to allow a Filipino to participate in a study on Asian Americans. If Filipinos cannot claim their Asian heritage and their culture is not as widespread in the US as other immigrant groups' cultures, where do Filipino Americans fit in? Regarding other identities of other immigrant groups, Ocampo wrote, "The 19th century Sicilian farmer became the Italian upon arriving to American shores. Today, generations later, his grandchildren are white Americans. Identities can also shift in real time. Jamaicans and Haitians who migrate to the United States all of a sudden become black Americans. There are select groups who can even vacillate between racial groups that people tend to view as separate. Dominicans are seen as African American and Latino, Indo-Caribbeans blend in with blacks, West Indians, and South Asian communities. In part, this is based on how others perceive them. It also has to do with how people see themselves. In other words, identity is a two-way street." End quote. Looking at the history of Filipino immigration, they were first brought to the US for agriculture work due to the Philippines being a US colony. Part of the Tydings-McDuff Act of 1934 included that the Philippines must send a quota of immigrants to the US. Many of these immigrants ended up settling in California. Moving towards the 1960s, though, the Hart-Celler Act, which removed many discriminatory immigration bans against Asian countries, saw an influx of middle-class professional Filipinos immigrate to the US. As Ocampo mentioned above, the identity group Filipinos will be seen as or identify as actually has a lot to do with which identity group they're surrounded with or end up getting quote-unquote placed with. So, if they're surrounded by, say, a Mexican Latino population, they'll be more likely to be identified as Mexican or Latino, and then go on to identify with that external assessment. Thus, in many cases, a Filipino American is often subsumed into another culture than their own. This process actually has the effect of removing a Filipino's core identity, willingness to identify as Asian American, unless of course they identify with that already, and the establishing of Filipino culture in the US as strongly as other immigrant group cultures, especially if, once again, many Filipinos are being subsumed into other cultures. Jose Antonio Vargas from Newsweek describes this process as, and I quote, "Filipinos viewing race as a culturally based identity. Many will explicitly disidentify from Asian Americans, asserting that popular constructions of the pan-ethnic category fail to describe their own experiences as Filipinos." For the Philippines, that's it. Thank you for listening to the Seven Nation Army podcast.